Okay. Well, thanks so much, Joseph, for an excellent talk. And thank you again, Professor Sunmin Kim, and to Kim Sung-ha for all of your help and for inviting me here. This is a great honor. So I will talk today about my own book project, which I'm still writing. So any of your comments and your questions will be extremely useful because I'm still at the stage where I can fix some things. The title of my book is Kingdom of Pines, State Forestry and the Making of Korea, where I look at what is basically the longest continuous state forestry system in world history, the state forestry system of the Joseon dynasty. And so today I'm going to give you a sense of sort of the broader comparative and local perspectives that I'm examining in my book. So I teach at Durham University in the United Kingdom, which, for those of you who don't know, is in the northeastern part of England, just south of Scotland. So most of my students are white British students mostly from the London area, mostly southern England, mostly from middle-class backgrounds. Those who take my class on Korean history thus have very little connection to Korea. They don't know much about Korea. So I often have to start with this map, giving a general sense of the geography. And also, you have to hook these students in. You have to get them interested in Korea, or they might leave. They might tell their friends to never take my class again. And so it's important to bring up certain modes of comparison with the country they are most familiar with, which is the United Kingdom. First thing I start with is size. To the students' surprise, I tell them, the Korean Peninsula is actually about the same size as Great Britain, roughly similar, which maybe surprises some Koreans as well. And also, the two areas, historically until today, are similar levels of population density, but their geographies, their physical geographies are quite different. Great Britain, of course, far less mountainous, and its forests were actually largely deforested by the 17th century. Great Britain thus famously had to import many of its key timber resources from abroad from a very early age, from the 17th century onward, from Scandinavia and later from North America. And famously, some scholars argue it was this lack of trees which ironically led to the great economic success in Britain that we call the Industrial Revolution, notably the lack of fuel wood, the lack of access to organic sources of fuel incentivized coal mining and coal production in the United Kingdom, incentivizing technologies like steam that in turn led to Britain becoming a pioneer in the most important, perhaps the most important economic transformation in world history. Korea, on the other hand, would take a very different path. As I argue in my book, Joseon, rather than accepting the inevitable deforestation and logging of its woodlands, took extraordinary measures throughout its 5 centuries to protect and conserve certain forests, especially pine forests that predominated along the coastal areas of the Korean Peninsula. So that's the story I'm talking about in my book and that I'll explain today. How Koreans were able to conserve and protect woodland for such a long period, essentially creating, like I say, the longest continuous state forestry system in world history. And all the more remarkable because Joseon Korea received very little overseas imports of timber before the 19th century. So unlike Great Britain, there isn't much timber coming in from abroad into Joseon. Of course, Joseon famously regulated some forms of foreign trade. And instead, what you see is dominance of bureaucratic internal forest management linked to military, political, and cultural interests. I'll talk about these particular interests in my lecture today. And also, another interesting phenomenon, while forest conservation was largely, in some ways, a state-run affair, there's another remarkable development in Joseon in the 18th and 19th centuries in particular. At the local level, the development of what we would probably call sort of today a community level forestry organizations, but in the Joseon period are called 금송계, 송계, which is it's a difficult term to translate into English. And I've received many comments on this from various scholars. So in my book, I just call them pine protection 계, which, yeah, we'll talk more about later. And the environmental consequences were immense, the most notable being the imposition of large-scale pine monoculture, pine-dominant forests in many parts of the Korean peninsula. Again, especially in the coastal areas of southern and western Korea. So what I'm talking about today is also a history of a particular interspecies alliance, that between humans and pines on the Korean peninsula, and very much encapsulates, I think, sort of a central theme of environmental history. Many people, many students in particular, often ask me, what is environmental history? And my basic answer is, environmental history, it's a story of a particular relationship in a particular place. The relationship between human and non-human species and the spaces they share and inhabit. And in turn, as we'll see in the workshop tomorrow as well, but thus much of environmental history encapsulates these different values, the different valences, the different processes through which these relationships were processed throughout human history. When I situate Korea to a non-Korean audience, basically what I do all the time, talking about Korea to students who know very little about Korean history, also my own colleagues who may not be very familiar with Korea. Environmental history often provides, I think, a very useful analytical framework through which we can understand common problems, common contexts that people have shared and faced throughout world history. And trees, the problem of wood, is, I think, one of the central problems, so what I would call a permeable analytical lens through which we can situate countries like Korea globally and have a common plane, a common sort of discourse through which we can talk about history with people who specialize in other regions. And they can see here, the temperate mixed forest zones of the world share certain interesting commonalities. We're talking about Eastern North America, Northwestern Europe, and Northeast Asia. These are some of the more densely populated areas throughout global history, or at least especially from the 18th century onward. These are also some of the key economic zones in the world still today. And they also happen to share similar sylvan ecologies, similar types of forest ecologies, which in turn have inflected the way institutions and societies have developed in these particular regions throughout global history. And so if we think about wood as this sort of common problem that all people face throughout history, everyone needed wood in pre-industrial times for fuel, for construction, as the basic raw chemical matter. It means that wood is this common dependency and a common problem that every society throughout the world had to face. Governments want to privilege access to wood for shipbuilding, for construction, for preserving soil to prevent floods, as Joseph talked about. But ordinary people need wood for very different matters. For daily life, for the building, for agricultural implements, for basic fuel, for the home, for the hearth, and also as space for grazing for their animals. And so wood can also be seen, timber can also be seen as a sort of contested material that has in turn had enormous impact throughout global history, has again shaped numerous institutions and societies. And so you can see here just examples of different strategies countries have taken, especially in the pre-industrial era, toward this problem of wood. England, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, facing deforestation throughout much of Lower England already by the 17th and 18th centuries, England takes this strategy of acquiring the necessary timber from abroad, from the Baltic region, from North America, and then later investing heavily in coal mining, coal production. China, on the other hand, took a very different route as well. Recent scholarship by scholars like Ian Miller and Meng Zhang have argued that silvicultural and commercial operations became key ways for acquiring necessary wood and timber in many parts of southern China, in particular, in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Now, in the cases of places like Renaissance Venice or Tokugawa Japan, more ecologically precarious areas that also faced, again, ecological vulnerabilities, you see the creation of complex forestry bureaucracies that try to adjust themselves to local conditions. So Korea, in some ways, could fall into the third category. So I'll talk more about this in a bit. And in the case of places like early modern France, you see the imposition of highly centralized forms of forestry that are probably more familiar in the modern world today, where the state basically takes eminent domain over vast stretches of forest land and privileges the state's access to those forests for shipbuilding in particular and for any sort of major government use. In France, as scholars like Kiko Madison have argued, the state's strong centralizing tendencies when it came to forestry actually incurred great resentment in certain parts of France. And in 1789, during the early years of the French Revolution, the first people that people in eastern France would kill once they found out about the revolution starting in Paris would be the local forestry wardens who they had had so much conflict with over the course of the 18th century in terms of battles over local wood usufruct, wood usage rights. The main sort of tree I'll be talking about today in the Korean case, the main sort of interspecies alliance we're talking about, is that between Koreans and the pine tree, notably Pinus thunbergi and Pinus densiflora, known as the red pine and the black pine. So these trees, when Koreans talk about sonamu in the records, these are often the types of the specific pine species they're often talking about. And these trees are interesting for numerous reasons. First of all, they grow extremely quick. In the Joseon Dynasty, the crop rotations, the logging rotations for a lot of pine trees was extremely rapid, 20 to 30 years often. So 20 to 30-year growing spans before logging. And pines have numerous advantages in the pre-industrial world. They're easily recognizable, they are usually relatively straight, and can be utilized for a wide variety of applications, for shipbuilding, for edifice construction, and for fuel and agricultural implements. They can be burned in tidal flats to make salt. There is this sort of wide ubiquity in terms of the pine that was extremely valuable. And what's also interesting again about pine is that it is one of these species that has done very well through its relationship with humans. Pine is a shade intolerant. Most species of pine are shade intolerant. In other words, they do very well only if their competitors, like oaks and so forth, are eliminated. So pine, the dominance of pine and related conifers across the globe is very much a byproduct of the rise of human civilization. Humans selectively cutting competitors that could have prevented the growth of pine in many parts of the world. And in turn, as I'll talk about later today, the grazing of animals and other paraphernalia of human agriculture also has stimulated pine growth at the expense of deciduous competitors in many parts of the world, including in Korea. So the first two chapters of my book, which I won't talk about too much today, focus more on forestry in the Goryeo and early Joseon dynasties. So I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you wish, but what I'll be focusing on in my lecture today is more the latter half of the Joseon dynasty. But state forestry is something that appears quite early in the records of the Joseon era. Basically, if you look at the Joseon Wangjo Shillok, from the late 14th century onward, from the 1390s onward. And by 1448, if we look at the Sejongshillok, over 291 locations, or so-called kumsan locations, restricted forest locations, have been mapped out throughout the Korean peninsula. And the terms for these restricted forests will change over time. In the later Joseon dynasty, you see terms like Bongsan, which I translate as reserve forest. You see areas just called Songcheon, like pine fields. Essentially, though, these are all talking about similar types of spaces. Woodlands that are basically privileged for state use, and thus use by non-state actors is technically forbidden, although, as I'll talk about today, and as I talk about extensively in my book, those prohibitions were often negotiable and could be violated, especially depending on one's own status. And again, throughout the Joseon dynasty, sort of the key zone, the key sort of epicenter of forestry operations will be largely in this blue zone in the southwest, stretching largely from the western coast of Chungcheong province down through southern Jeolla. The latter half of the Joseon dynasty, you see the number of state forests expand for reasons that I'll talk about today. So you see more and more protected forests emerge in the upper Han River Basin, especially in what is now, Gangwon province, in the Taebaek Mountain Range. You see also, as I'll talk about today, Kumsongye form, especially in the Nakdong River Basin, especially in what is now North Gyeongsang Province. And in this blue zone here, the number of state forests in Jeolla also expand, especially in the island zones off the southern coast of the Korean peninsula. So talking about places like Huksan-do, Jin-do, also places like Anmyeon off the coast of the Tan Peninsula. And I know this is a bit of a blurry map, but as you can see, this is the contemporary distribution of coniferous pine forest in South Korea today. And interestingly, you still see, again, the ecological legacies of the Joseon dynasty. That sort of green belt you see here of concentrated pine growth, it is very much reflected, it very much mirrors the protected forest zones of the Joseon dynasty, which is not surprising. Again, pine is a species, pine is a species that very much has leveraged its alliance with humans. As I said before, pine grows very well when its competitors are eliminated, and also pine tends to acclimate soil to its growth. Pine needles, as they accumulate on the ground, tend to create a more acidic soil in which pine can grow very well in, but often its deciduous competitors can't. And so soil scientists have proven that the soil, especially in the southwestern part of Jeolla, tends to be a little more acidic than in other parts of Korea. That's partly due to long, of course, centuries of rice farming, but also certainly due to the long histories of pine growth in those regions. So again, this is the sort of central question that I'll be coming back to again and again today. How did a pre-industrial state, a pre-modern state, expand and maintain a pine-centric forestry system for 5 centuries? It's mind-boggling, it's in some ways, that a pre-industrial state, especially a state like Joseon, which we do not, in popular memory, we don't associate with say, sophisticated technologies of surveillance and so forth, how could this society maintain a type of conservation system we more associate with 20th, 21st century regimes? And these are the sort of three major arguments I put forth in my book. First of all, both intentionally and unintentionally, Choson bureaucrats were able to exploit particular ecological processes that were favorable to pine growth. One of those processes, obviously, is protecting pine, tends to perpetuate pine due to the ecological proclivities that I mentioned earlier. But I'll talk about other sort of ecological processes in a bit, including the relationship between pines and certain types of fauna, especially horses, which were also key to the proliferation of pine in the western and southern portions of Korea. Also, expanding the role of certain administrative institutions, especially the military, after the Imjin War, in the largely more peaceful period from the mid-17th century to the mid-19th century, when the Korean military was no longer heavily involved in fighting necessarily and became much more of an administrative institution, with forestry becoming one of its major prerogatives in certain parts of the Korean peninsula. And finally, incorporating and accommodating local organizations, including what I would argue is sort of the highly distinctive form of Korean organization, the Kae. And so the rise of pine protection Kae, I argue, in the 18th and 19th centuries also became a key mode of operation for forestry in the Joseon dynasty. In other words, the sustainability of state forestry in the Joseon dynasty owes a lot to the rise of pine protection Kae, which were instrumental in protecting pine forests in numerous parts of southern Korea. So this is not just a story of state-level actors imposing their prerogatives on a docile populace. It is also very much a story of innovation at the local level. Koreans forming a quite distinctively Korean institution, the Kae, and utilizing it for certain forms of what we would call environmental conservation today, protecting local pine forests for various reasons that I'll talk about. So how state forestry expanded after the Imjin War. So I'm not going to go into the details of the Imjin War today, but all of you already know one of the great heroes of the war, probably the greatest military hero in Korean history, was Lee Sung-shin. And one of the more notable aspects of Lee Sung-shin was his utilization of naval bases in the southwest. And a lot of these naval bases, of course, were set up way back in the early Joseon dynasty. Partly to, of course, establish ensconced territoriality to protect the maritime border, but also to protect local forests. And we see records going way back to the first decade of the 15th century, to the early years of the Joseon dynasty, where Joseon government is ordering ordering bureaucrats to protect forests along the southern coast of the Korean peninsula, precisely the same areas Lee Sung-shin would utilize to pursue his famous naval operations during the Imjin War. And so very early on, if we look at the Gwanghyung Ilgi and the Seonjo Shillok, there's a lot of anxiety amongst bureaucrats about what are we going to do if the Japanese come back. There was a wide recognition among Korean bureaucrats that the Navy had been instrumental. So protecting timber, protecting wood resources becomes this sort of key prerogative. And this sort of a key strategy for, in a sense, rehabilitating the countryside after the depredations of the Imjin War. So we see this sort of doubling down on state forestry after the Imjin War, and in turn, especially with a clear focus on the Southwest. And this required the government, again, to not only send down more personnel and increase the number of reports regarding these regions, but also require the government to expand state forests into areas where such institutions had not existed before. And again, especially in the island zones of southwestern Korea. Now we see a picture here of these cute horses. These are the Jeju horse, of course. As many of you know, during the Mongol period in the late Goryeo dynasty, the Mongols established numerous mokjang, numerous ranches in the southwestern part of Korea in particular, most famously on Jeju, but also on other islands. And the early Joseon government continued to maintain many of these mokjang, many of these ranches throughout the early Joseon period, with many of them raising horses that were utilized as cavalry. Many of these mokjang went into ruin, became defunct during and after the Imjin War, as many refugees in particular moved into these areas and essentially greatly shifted the local economy and ecology. And by the early 17th century, if you look at government records, bureaucrats complained that these islands these mokjang don't even have any horses anymore. Many have been killed during the Imjin War or had died from disease. In the UK, there's a scholar, Bai-Pei Duan, who is doing some great research on epizootic diseases, animal transmitted diseases that were supposedly prevalent in the early 17th century, especially in the period from the Imjin War through the two Manchu invasions. So this is also another interesting avenue for research in a sense of, because horses, of course, were central to many aspects of Korean life, but numerous scholars have pointed out the number of horses and the importance of horses, there's even the size of horses throughout the Joseon dynasty seems to diminish. And whether disease played a role, whether simply demographic expansion played a role, it's debatable, but again, it's something that's worth further research. What does this have to do with pines? This is a picture of a so-called pasture pine in eastern North America, in Massachusetts, from the early 20th century. I'm showing a picture from North America for a specific reason. Pasture pine is a global phenomenon. It's basically what happens when horses graze in a certain area for a very long time. Horses are quite wide browsers. They'll eat all kinds of plants, including young deciduous trees, but horses will generally avoid conifers. So what you see happening in many parts of the world, in areas especially that go through extensive horse grazing, is that the plant that benefits the most from the arrival of the horse is often the pine. And what's interesting is that if you look at the Shilluk and the Bibyeonsa, there's some bureaucrats actually recognize this, that these areas that once were mokjang are areas very appropriate for pine. Now, it's doubtful that these Joseon bureaucrats understood the intricacies of the ecological process here, but there is a wide recognition that these mokjang could be very conveniently turned into state forests that could serve this broader state interest in protecting pine forests after the depredations of the Imjin War, and in turn, ensuring the availability of timber for shipbuilding and other needs. After the Imjin War, we see again like the story of the decline of the horse, at least in numbers in Korean life. By the 19th century, scholars like Chung Ya-kyung are saying that, oh, our horses are so pathetic and diseased and so forth. Now, we don't know the exact numbers here. Some of the records we see do seem to point to the diminishing of horses, at least in these island zones. And instead, in their place, we see increasing number of state forests being placed on these former horse ranches. I wrote an article about this some years ago that appeared in Journal of Asian Studies, but numerous islands that were once almost exclusively mokjang in the early Joseon dynasty increasingly are becoming state forest zones labeled as Pongsan by the 17th and 18th centuries. So partly it is not just a mere bureaucratic choice, but also a bureaucratic choice that is being also enabled through a particular ecological transition. And again, another shifting of interspecies alliances, where the interspecies alliance between Koreans and horses is declining in some ways, while the particular relationship with pines is prospering. And to manage all this, we see the changing role of the military in Korean administrative life. As I mentioned before, and as numerous Korean scholars have wrote about, from the mid-17th century to the mid-19th century, the role of the military in Korea as a sort of broad administrative institution, rather than simply a fighting force, is critical. And forestry becomes an extremely important duty for some of these sugunjin, these naval garrisons that occupy all sorts of important administrative duties along the Korean coast. And so you see one such picture here of a naval garrison in southwestern Korea in the late Joseon dynasty. So the duties of these naval garrisons when it came to forestry were numerous. The soldiers were supposed to guard these forests against intruders. They were also supposed to, in some way, in some cases, actually engage in logging and the transportation of the timber. We see some cases of garrisons corveying local villagers to accomplish these tasks. They were quite varied. Also, the duties of these soldiers also included sometimes the removal of pine moth larvae. So-called 송충이. So this is a picture of a pine moth, the larva when it grows up. So this is the species Dendrolamus spectabilis, the pine moth. And we see, interestingly, increasing reports, probably not surprising, from the 18th century onward of these sort of pine moth larvae, of these 송충이 infestations in these increasingly monocultural forests of southern Korea, and with orders coming down for soldiers to pick off these pine moth larvae from these infested trees. With the expansion of particular administrative institutions such as the military, we also see thus increasing state intrusion in the everyday lives of Korean people. And that intrusion, I think, is well reflected in this quote by, of course, the famous scholar Yoon Son-do in his 시패 사조서, part of his one of his broader essays that he wrote. But Yoon Son-do, of course, was precisely from this region that was the epicenter of state forestry in the Joseon period in southern Jeolla. And he writes here, where there are pine forests, the local residents do not think to dare peek in. They fear pines as if they were tigers. Consequently, pines do not fail to grow verdant in populated areas. And then he goes on in very hyperbolic Confucian terms. What the state should love and support is surely its people, not its pines. But now the state is for the sake of pines and does not consider its people. I like this quote a lot because, in a sense, we've been talking just about Korea for the last 10, 15 minutes or so, but this allows again to resituate forestry in a global perspective. This is a quote by the American historian Carl Jacobi talking about the rise of the national park system and basically the modern environmental conservation or modern environmental conservation institutions in the United States. National parks like where Joseph used to work in Zion. For many rural communities, the most notable feature of conservation was the transformation of previously acceptable acts into illegal practices. Hunting or fishing becomes redefined as poaching. Foraging becomes trespassing. The setting of fires becomes arson. And the cutting of trees becomes timber theft. So here, Carl Jacobi is basically talking about a phenomenon you see ongoing throughout 19th and 20th century America, where ordinary people, both white people, but also indigenous Americans, are engaging in basically daily acts that ordinary acts that sustain their lives. Burning forest land to plant fields, hunting or fishing to feed their families. But it is when certain institutions, notably the state, start criminalizing these acts for broader purposes. for the establishment of national parks or state forests, that we see some of the key conflicts of not just modern, but also, as I argue, pre-modern history emerge. In other words, some of the most poignant conflicts between state and society throughout global history often start in these particular spaces where particular resources are contested. And then the mechanism of dispossession is not pushing these people out by force, but something more subtle, criminalizing the very acts that sustain their lives, criminalizing their basic interaction with the environment. That is something that is going on in 19th and 20th century America, and arguably also in Joseon Korea in the 17th century, where the increasing intrusion of the state into the daily lives of ordinary people is creating a situation where ordinary people, ordinary local residents, have to flee the forest and cannot even engage in the basic acts that sustain their lives, the cutting of fuel wood or the cutting of basic branches or timber. And the broader implications are clear here. And for scholars like Carl Jacobi, who was heavily influenced by the social scientist James Scott, this is the dark side of the conservationist state, where conservation becomes not a sort of not a movement that saves the planet, but a movement that very much represents the war of the government on the governed, urban upon rural, of power over the powerless. Did Koreans just roll over and let the state take control of every forest across the Korean Peninsula? Of course not. There is another side to the story that is just as key, as I mentioned. As state intrusion becomes a greater feature of forest administration in the 17th century, we see, of course, a reaction and new developments. Notably, the rise of the kumsongge, the pine protection ke, as a key aspect of local forestry practice. So this is the roster of one such kumsongge from Hadong-gun in southern Gyeongsang province. So this is a notable one. This is a document I found in the Harvard Yenching Library, and it's a roster. So you see each of these villages are submitting two particular forest wardens. So one is listed as a Kamgwan, one as a Sanjik. And the Hadong-gun kumsongge is notable because it's a quite large one. Most kumsongge are much smaller. But it's one example of many similar organizations that emerged remarkably across southern Korea in the 18th and 19th century, turning a largely state-centered story of forest conservation, a mostly top-down story, into a bottom-up one by the 18th and 19th centuries. I know most of you are familiar with the ke, but this is something I always have to go in depth on to explain to Western audiences. And again, it's a term that is oddly difficult to translate into English. Many scholars like me who are trained in North America or Europe were often told to avoid using a specifically East Asian lexicon. In other words, try to translate as many of these East Asian terms as possible. The sort of preservation of East Asian terms being considered some Orientalist or impermeable. But I think the ke is one of these Korean institutions that does, I think, run into the problem of difficulty in translation, partly due to their wide variety, part due to their wide application, and again, partly due to their quite distinctive role and quite distinctive origins within Korean history. So of course the ke is a type of mutual aid organization that, different type of ke for so many different occasions, but generally start proliferating throughout, we see at least records of ke start proliferating more from the late Joseon period, even if we can find some from earlier. And functions of ke range from, of course, resource management and tax collection to supporting education and funerals. As many of you already know, merchants would form their own specific type of ke. We could probably translate those as guilds. But also we have these local communities forming their own ke to support expensive occasions like funerals or the education of children and so forth, and also tax collection. And at least in the Joseon period, we find that Kae usually composed most adult men in a village, especially pine protection Kae, but also, as with many aspects of Joseon society, were often subdivided along status lines. But of course, as we get into the 20th century, this changes as well as more and more Kae, and probably a majority of Kae, start becoming dominated more by women and so forth. But that's another story. How do we situate Kae within this broader narrative of state forestry? So I argue that if we look through these Kae documents, there's three particular ways we can situate them. First of all, Kae is part of the broader state forestry system. Literally, Kae operating in conjunction with government interests. That's one way we can interpret them. And the Hadong Kae in particular can be seen as this, as I mentioned earlier, from 1860, can be seen along these lines. If we look at the first line of their, I guess you could call it their charter, there is no matter of greater importance in the operation of the state than the protection of pines. Now, did people actually really believe this? Probably not. But remember, this charter was, of course, submitted to the local office. So in a sense, there is a performative element, perhaps, to some of these Kae. And I'd be curious to get your own comments and thoughts on this. But from what I've seen, government officials never reject any of these charters. And in many ways, the Kumsongge seem to, at least from the point of view of local bureaucrats, from magistrates and so forth, seem to fulfill broader functions, broader purposes that government officials were desiring. In other words, local communities protecting these forests, these pine forests, fit perfectly well into broader government interests. In this particular, if we look further in this particular document, the members of this Hadong Kumsongge actually argue that they want to remove local bullies from the community who are punishing people for going into protected forests. They basically want to handle these operations themselves. And they also agree to submit necessary timber quotas to the government when needed. And the government generally agreed. On places like Anmyeon-do as well, we see similar sort of Kumsongge operating on behalf of the state. So rather than the government going into these parts of Anmyeon-do to harvest the timber themselves, these local Kumsongge in Anmyeon would actually do the work for them. And we see that happening all the way to the 1890s, at least in Anmyeon. The great majority of Kumsongge, though, probably more reflected local elite interests, in a sense, mechanisms of local elite dominance. So at least the records that I've seen and the scholarship by South Korean scholars that I've seen, this is the great majority of most of these Kumsongge in terms of their operation and their composition. Local Yangban coming together to protect local pine forests, especially pine groves that were in strategic areas, such as those that surrounded their ancestral tombs. Scholars, this is one book that I really enjoyed and had a great influence on me for this work and helped me guide me toward particular sources as well. This book by Bae Soo-ho and Im Young-seok that extensively looked through various types of Kumsongge in the Joseon and period and the 20th century. These two scholars were more interested, though, they were not interested in Kumsongge necessarily in terms of its role in the Joseon period or its relationship to the state forestry system. They were actually more interested in whether Kumsongge are examples of sort of common pool resource management, sort of examples of sustainable resource management in a sort of East Asian setting. I'll talk more about why this is important in a bit. And if we look at the records of Kumsongye from the Joseon dynasty, we do find some interesting aspects that also point to broader sort of global and comparative implications. The fact that these are local grassroots community movements coming together, often again, sometimes to reflect a late interest, but sometimes some of these ke would operate across status lines to protect local pine forests, and more importantly, many of these ke would continuously protect these pine forests even after the Joseon dynasty ended. So one particular ke that I looked at and I also visited was a ke in Kurim in Jeolla province, which this Kurim this Kurim Kumsongye I think started sometime in the 18th century, and they continuously managed the same set of pine forests through the colonial period, and they still exist today. So for scholars like these two social scientists, it's an interesting question. Why and how did Koreans not just start these organizations, but also continuously maintain them throughout the 20th century, through the tumultuous decades of the 20th century, all the way to the present day? And they're inspired by the broader lessons and the broader work of this scholar, Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics, a social scientist who spent much of her life looking at these sort of local groups, local grassroots or community organizations that are able to sustain resources across generations. In other words, trying to figure out how people can come together and sustain resources over long periods of time. One of the basic sort of quandaries of our era today. How do we protect this planet? How do we protect local resources? How do we avoid the sort of environmental degradation and scarcity of resources that have constantly plagued civilizations and still plague our world today? And Eleanor Ostrom famously came up with these sort of 8 effective rules. She basically spent her whole life looking at various different examples of local conservation groups, historically and today. And she found these sort of 8 rules that she says that all sort of effective commons management all share. So this will be the last, just to wrap up, but I'll try to just want to take a little bit of time to go through these and think. This is a very effective way, I think, to kind of combine social sciences and history, using social science to think about our own historical cases more critically. For instance, when we look at these rules, let's think about the Kumsongye and Joseon forestry in general. Ostrom argued that all effective commons management in history and in the contemporary world have clearly defined boundaries. Now, in the Joseon case, this was often a problem. Wardens, government, any sort of and soldiers were supposed to put up clear kumpyo, like clear postings about where restricted forests ended and started. These postings, of course, were not well maintained. So these boundaries between state forests and so-called more chapsu or mixed forests open to logging were often quite blurry throughout the Joseon dynasty. On the other hand, it seems that Kumsongye were far more effective at defining these boundaries, largely through patrols and sort of extra-legal violence that could be enacted on trespassers. Trespassers often meaning neighboring villages, people who are not part of the ke who trespassed onto these forests. So in a sense, if you look at the Joseon case, in other words, probably Kumsongye were far more effective at defining boundaries than government officials were. Matching rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. Again, this is something that local organizations can do far better than government bureaucrats. So again, another example of how and why Kumsongye could have been more effective in the Joseon dynasty and into the 20th century. Ensuring that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. Again, another example why Kumsongye were more effective than state bureaucrats, with Kumsongye largely, again, reflecting the interests of local community members. Of course, this is a case where status divisions in Korean society could have an effect. Many of these Kumsongye, as I mentioned, were dominated by local elite families by local yangban, and in turn could shift the nature of local forest protection and the sale of timber and so forth in their favor. But again, not only Kumsongye records, but also diaries such as the Nosangchu-ilgi and diaries such as this give great insight into the numerous conflicts Yangban would have with each other and with non-Yangban groups over forest land, over woodland usage, over the sale and possession of woodland. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you wish. Making sure the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. This is, I think, again, a curious aspect of the Kumsongye. Again, maybe someone disagrees here, but at least in my book so far, I've been arguing that there was relatively little conflict between Kumsongye and state forestry officials. Of course, there's numerous conflicts between chosen government officials and other types of groups. For example, Joseph talked about the Hwajeonmin, and of course, slash and burn agriculture was widely prosecuted in the Joseon dynasty, but still, you see magistrates tolerating certain forms of fire fields of Hwajeon in some cases, and Kumsongye as well, of course, tried to ban this sort of, at least illegal fires or unmanaged fires in their own properties. Finally, developing a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior. This was an obsession of many Kumsongye. If you look at Kumsongye records, many of them barely talk about trees at all and talk more about the level of punishments given for certain transgressions, how much a person would be beaten for cutting down a tree, and so forth. And again, this applies to number 6, using graduated sanctions for rule violations. And also, of course, providing accessible, low-cost means for dispute resolution. In many ways, these ke could also operate at the village level as extra-legal forms of discipline that could operate outside of the Joseon legal system. That being said, there's numerous lawsuits, numerous petitions related to forest land, especially usufruct rights for forests around tombs throughout the Joseon dynasty. And these are often called in Korean the Sansong documents and so forth. And then finally, this is probably the one element that was missing in the Joseon dynasty, but building responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from lowest level up to the top. That's not something we see, at least the integration of local level forms of commons management all the way through middle tiers of administration to the top. That's not something we see in the Joseon dynasty, arguably not something we see until the Park Chung-hee period, at least when it comes to forestry. So as a conclusion, pine-centric state forestry was critical, I argue, to the making of Korea as a centrally governed space and as a particular landscape. It was this pine-centric landscape imagined and desired by bureaucrats, a little kingdom of pines built around this concept of songjang, the administration of pines, as a key component of government administration and a broader objective imagined and desired by bureaucrats who had very little actual connection to the lands being managed. And in the later centuries of the Joseon dynasty, the local reorganization of sylvan spaces, especially as the government began intruding more into the lives of residents, especially in the southern and western regions of Korea in the 17th century, we see a particular reaction, as I've narrated here, the growth and expansion of Kumsongye, partly as a reaction to the growth of particular government institutions, particularly the military, into sylvan affairs. The result was this sort of domination of pine in the Korean landscape, as I've shown, especially in particular areas, and left interesting legacies. For instance, during the colonial period, when the Japanese tried to establish their own forestry system in Korea, which, if you're interested in that topic, definitely please read the book that Joseph mentioned, David Fedman's book on colonial forestry. The Japanese came in with very different ideas about what types of trees should be planted. Many of these Japanese foresters and botanists from the early colonial period had been trained in places like France and Germany, where they had learned from European foresters that oak was the king of trees, and then pine was this sort of scrubby pioneer species that only appears in sort of marginal or unprofitable lands. The Japanese, these early colonial Japanese scientists applied the same logic to the Korean peninsula. The very avatar of the Joseon dynasty, the very objective of the Joseon dynasty, a pine-centric landscape, was turned around, was flipped on its head and used and depicted as a symbol of Korean backwardness. And the Japanese would instead try to plant different types of trees, like acacia and so forth, to fit their colonial view of ecological modernity. And it's a certain theory of national ruination through red pine, akamatsu bokokuron, that you see in some of these Japanese records. This idea that Koreans had ruined their land through the accumulation, through the expansion of pine. But again, this is an idea that not only, of course, it served Japanese colonial interests, but also an interesting product of sort of the transnational movement of ideas in this period, notably the Japanese ready reception of European ideas regarding Sylvan hierarchies. But still today, you could say the strong relationship between Koreans and pines remained. The Japanese were not able to extinguish that particular relationship. And we see here children doing the same activities that Joseon soldiers were ordered to do way back in the Joseon period, picking pine moth larvae by hand as part of the wider afforestation efforts that emerged in Korea after the Korean War. So the state forestry system of the Joseon dynasty may have died with the Joseon dynasty, but the relationship, the strong interspecies alliance between Koreans and pines would remain to the present day. Thank you very much.